back. And as we discussed last time, Abbott and Costello are about to return to the formula that made them famous. They are going back to the armed forces, only instead of the Army, the Navy, or the Air Corps, this time they're going all the way to the Foreign Legion. Before we get into talking about this movie, we got to kind of talk a little history of what was happening with them around this time. So it's one of those eerie things that it feels like history kind of is repeating itself on the boys. So once again, coming off of the success of Meets Frankenstein, they were riding a tidal wave of momentum. We talked a little bit about this in the last review, that their films were racking up box office. They were rejuvenated, basically. You know, they were given kind of a fresh lease on life, and they were really taking advantage of it. The films that they had been putting out were big successes. As I mentioned last time, they were the third highest box office draw after almost a decade of movies and more than 20 films together. That is a huge deal. But the pace and everything, and the fact that they're getting older, finally kind of caught up with them, and Lou came down with a second case of rheumatic fever. Not as bad as his first one, thankfully, but it was still enough to kind of knock him on his ass for a while. And then right after that, he had a gallbladder infection. So Lou was in some pretty poor health there for a while. In fact, if I remember correctly, I believe it was almost 10 months in between the end of production on Meet the Killer and the start of production on this, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but considering that these guys have been pumping out like 2 films, 3 films a year for over 10 years, you know, that is quite a delay. They hadn't really had that long of a hiatus since the Lost Year there. So this is their first film back, and I feel that watching it, you can kind of tell a little bit. Kind of like you could tell when they had returned with In Society and Here Come the Coeds, that it was taking Lou a little bit longer to kind of, you know, get his bounce back. He was still suffering from both the personal and physical losses he had maintained. And I do feel that as I watched this movie, even before I did the background research and kind of found this out, it did seem like he was a little slower. Just not as energetic as he had been, and, you know, who can blame him? He was sick for a long time. So I think that might be a contributing factor to kind of what's going on with this movie. So let's talk a little bit about this one, because this is an interesting entry into their film career. So first of all, what is the plot? Okay, bear with me on this one. So in this film, Abbott and Costello play wrestling promoters. Awesome. 2 of my favorite things, Abbott and Costello and wrestling. I mean, what can go wrong? And one of their attractions is an Arab wrestler. They never really say like what country he's from, but, you know, an Arab wrestler named Abdullah, who kind of runs out on them because they wanted him to lose the match, and he decided to, you know, head back to his home country. So very much like you'd hear in modern day WWE, but however, I digress. So on the hook now from a loan shark, Abbott and Costello travel to, I forget which country they say they go to, but they travel to, you know, one of the Arabian countries in order to try to get him back. And in that process, they somehow run afoul of a corrupt Foreign Legion officer and some kind of evil sheik who have some plan of blowing up a railroad so that the railroad will go through their territory and they'll be paid more for it. I think that's what's going on. And so the corrupt Foreign Legion officer gets it in his head that Bud and Lou, two Americans wandering around asking for Abdullah, are somehow agents of the government or something, or spies, and so he tricks them into joining the Foreign Legion so he can kill them without suspicion. And of course they avoid that and end up falling in with the Sheik. It's all over the place. So right away, going into the description of this film, you can kind of see that we've backtracked a little. This film is much more reminiscent of their older films, their early films, than anything they've really done in a while. I've mentioned that other films kind of have that flavor to them. Mexican Hayride does a little bit. Actually, Mexican Hayride and African Screams are more reminiscent of their radio show. This is the first one that is really reminiscent of their early film career because, as you can kind of tell, just from me trying to relate the story to you, the plot is kind of all over the place and very nonsensical. It really does feel like just a series of events in order to move Abbott and Costello to one comedy bit to another. To their credit, they're not repeating their old routines here. They're just, reacting to the situation. They do all new stuff. Lou loses control of a Gatling gun. Lou runs the obstacle course and, of course, messes it up. Lou gets into a wrestling match and whatnot. But the story is just very, very nonsensical, and you can't really keep track of what they're doing there or who the bad guys. You just kind of know that everybody out to kill them is the bad guy, and the one woman that they meet who Lou at first mistakenly buys at a slave auction, and she turns out to be a French Interpol agent, and they team up that she's the good guy and everybody else is just out to get them. So story-wise, it's kind of a mess. It's kind of all over the place, and I am not even going to attempt to dissect the inaccuracies in Arabic culture and the lack of political correctness as it comes to as it relates to the instances in this film. I'm not even going to try because, yeah, again, with Africa Screams, with Ride 'em Cowboy, we really see how dated some of these things are, but it kind of plays into a lot of the widely held stereotypes of the time. The slave auction, the harem, the desert sheiks, the infidels, that kind of thing. So, let's just say it's a little uncomfortable at times. I don't know if it's as uncomfortable as things in Ride 'em Cowboy or Africa Screams, but it's certainly not good. But I feel like I'm dumping on this movie a little too much, and I've got to say that after watching it, I'm left with a much better opinion of it than I had originally had. This is one that I have not watched in a long time. As we enter into the latter half of these films, we're getting into the ones I don't watch as often, and we'll discuss why later. Matter of fact, I can't remember the last time I watched this one prior to this, but it's one of the ones I've only seen maybe once or twice, as opposed to some of these other ones that I've watched hundreds of times. So I didn't have a lot of memory of it, and the memories I did have were not of it being particularly good. It was more just kind of okay, that's a thing that exists. And I have to say that watching it back, I feel like I have a little bit better opinion of it now. In that it is fresh, and while they are kind of falling backwards in terms of story structure, the comedy is still good. And they make a lot of use out of the environment and the situation that they're in. One of the things that the writers were really trying to do with it is not just do a carbon copy of Buck Privates. They wanted to get them into different situations. They wanted to go back to what had always worked for Abbott and Costello, and really what has been the bread and butter of comedy since its inception, the fish out of water story. You put somebody who's not supposed to be in a high society situation in a high society situation. And of course, Abbott and Costello played this better than almost anyone. So now taking them out of their comfort zone of Brooklyn and putting them into a foreign country, a different culture, and a different form of armed service, there was a lot of material there, and I think they played it off pretty well. There was a lot of good stuff with them, with their training. Lou running the obstacle course is pretty funny. There's a whole section where they're lost in the desert, and it's pretty funny. It's very standard, you know, they see a mirage and, you know, it's not there, but it's pretty good, I must admit. So I feel like there is some good stuff going on in this film, but I do feel that the lack of any kind of cohesive follow-through or through line is what holds this one back a little bit, and does kind of give it that impression of Buck Private's lesser spin-off. You know what I mean? The wrestling bits are funny. Again, I'm a wrestling fan, so I love comedy wrestling in movies, or at least in old movies. And this one is really fun, with especially the opening with Bud going through the script. It's one of the first, you know, to expose the business, you know, talking about scripts and rehearsals and stuff, and treating it like a stage show as opposed to an actual sporting event. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know how common that was back then. I know they did it a little bit in Here Come the Co-Eds, but this time they really go in, and, you know, seeing Lou kind of being the practice dummy for these big wrestlers is pretty well done. I enjoyed that bit. Interesting. There's not a lot to talk about in terms of their co-stars for this one. It's a standard collection of, you know, well-traveled journeyman actors who, you know, pop up in, you know, a lot of different things. I think most of the actors in this had, you know, 200 some credits to their names by the time they passed away, but nothing really of note. There wasn't really a big thing that stood out about most of them, except one odd little exception. One odd little bitty exception. So the wrestler that they are chasing is a gentleman by the name of William Wee Willie Davis. That's his name, Wee Willie. Who played a lot of strongmen and thugs and whatnot in films. That was his bread and butter. Towards the end of this film, Bud and Lou are captured by the evil Sheik, and as it turns out, William Davis is the Sheik's cousin, and he forces Abbott and Costello to wrestle Abdullah and this other wrestler. And during the course of it, Abdullah, you know, Wee Willie Davis there, does a face turn and, you know, says, "I'm on your side. I want to get out of here. I'm going to help you, you know, do the bit where you pretend to blind me, and I'll go and fight my partner." You know, stuff they still do in wrestling, really, which is kind of funny. So that's a fun bit. But here's the fun little tidbit for movie fans. The other wrestler in this film is played by none other than Tor Johnson. Lovable, awesome Tor Johnson, who was, in fact, a wrestler in real life, but is most famous for his appearance as the slack-jawed imbecile in almost every Ed Wood movie. The great, gigantic Tor Johnson, known to Mystery Science Theater fans as Lobo, or more appropriately, Mr. Time for Go to Sleep. I love Tor Johnson. I have a soft spot in my heart for all of those B-level oddity actors. The Tor Johnsons, the Rondo Hattons, the Richard Keels. I have a big soft spot in my heart for them and love seeing them in stuff. And it was, when I realized that it was Tor Johnson, I was just, I geeked out. I marked out, to use wrestling terms. Like, oh, yay, it's Tor! Yeah. I wish there was more I could say about this one. This video is running shorter than the others, which, you know, is probably not a bad thing. I don't know how many people really want to watch me drive and talk for 20 minutes, but I'm really stretching for what to talk about in this film. It's a decent outing, but in terms of its place in the filmography and its stature amongst the other films that they did, it is one of their lesser entries. It's not a bad movie. It's just not particularly memorable, or there's nothing really unique about it. It's just kind of there. So it's not a bad one to catch. It's just not anything that's really going to stick with you. Or if it does, probably for all the wrong reasons, like the severe lack of political correctness, which was common at the time. The film is notable for one thing, and we do have to kind of talk about this just very briefly, is that this film marked the 15th anniversary of Abbott and Costello. 15 years together as a team. So, I think that's a pretty important thing. I think that's they stayed together longer than most tag teams. So, that's kind of it. I can't think of anything else that was really going on in their lives or in relation to this film. It's kind of there. So, yeah, it's kind of it's a refresher. It's their first one back after a hiatus. They need to kind of get back into it before they could really step up and deliver another great film, which I'm happy to say they are going to do. Because when we return, we will see just how big of an influence Meets Frankenstein was on their career, as we see what I feel is the spiritual successor to that film. If you could call anything a direct sequel to Meets Frankenstein, it is this film, and it does all the same things right, and is another great outing for Bud and Lou, as this time they meet another famous movie monster, one who has kind of been trying to make a comeback in previous years. So yes, when we return, Abbott and Costello will meet the Invisible Man. So thank you for joining me. We will see you then, but we won't see him. And as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.